So I am Andresa de Souza Santos. I'm a lecturer at the Latin American Center, and I'm co-convening this seminar series with Dr. Francesca Lessa, who is also a lecturer at the Latin American Center and at the Development Studies department, and Dr. Marianne Jimenez, who is a postdoc research associate at the Latin American Center. And we would like to welcome all of you to this third session of our seminar series. And this week, we all who study Latin America, we are very familiar with the importance of economic transitions in the area. But today we talk about another transition which may use similar analytical frameworks and when studying energy transitions. The presentation that we have today will showcase the ideas of Professor Hochstetler on wind and solar power in Brazil and South Africa, a very new book that I wish I had here in physical form, but she has, and there we are. And yes, and then we're going to learn a little bit more about this new publication. About our speaker, Professor Kathryn Hochstetler, she's head of the Department of International Development at the LSE, and she holds a PhD in political science from Minnesota. And she has always been interested in interdisciplinary study of environment and development. She has researched this theme from many angles, such as global environment negotiations, regional trade agreements, and the study of environmental movements, environmental policy, democratic institutions, and primarily in South America. However, she has also conducted field research in places like South Africa. Kathy will speak today for about 40 minutes, and then we have Q&A session afterwards. You are very welcome to write down your questions in the chat, but you're even more welcome to switch on your cam during the Q&A and ask them, let's say, in person. For some logistical information before we begin, I will ask you to right now, please mute all your microphones to avoid unwanted noise during the presentation. And Kathy, the floor, or rather the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Andresa. And I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so you can see my slides. It's always such a pleasure to come back to Oxford, and I have been there many times. And I do regret that this is the one time that I am coming to Oxford when there's not a drink afterwards. Usually I can count on that when I come to the university, but it is at least still a good time to tell you about this new book of mine. And I saw a number of old friends on the call and also many people I don't know, and look forward to hearing the questions that all of you might have about this book about political economies of energy transition. And just if you think about wind and solar power, there are some standard approaches to studying wind and solar power electricity. One of those comes from the field of science, and there's a great deal of attention to the planetary boundary that we're facing with climate change and the way in which if we don't decarbonize our electricity, that we will face even more climate change than is already coming. Another really common perspective for looking at solar power and wind power is that of the literature on socio-technical transition, which sees this as an exciting new industry that has a lot of potential for innovation and good jobs and might generate new kinds of industries on this foundation. And both of these standard approaches lead us to expect and to hope that there will be lots of wind and solar power produced. And therefore, and this is a chart from the beginning of my book, the actual outcomes for wind and solar power in Brazil and South Africa are rather strange, because wind power in Brazil does amazing, and it really grows over the time period that I study to be almost 10% of Brazil's built electricity capacity. But as you can see, that bottom line there, that red line, is Brazilian solar power. And it's very much slower, and there's much less of it than there is wind power. And South Africa's kind of in between, where it starts out almost like the Brazilians, really positively, and then seems to even go backwards. So a big part of my book is just trying to understand what's going on, because it's pretty obvious there's no straightforward explanation from these standard approaches, which both expect lots of wind and solar power. And so my argument is what we really need here is a Latin American studies approach. Or I did this slide just for you. I mean, in general, it's a comparative political economy approach, but it is also very much the approach of Latin American studies. And my argument here is that we should start to think about energy transition much more as a political economy transition. And that if we think about the things that we in Latin Americanists have used to understand past market transitions, like the move to greater market control in the from 1970s to 1990s, the retreat from that with the pink tide, we know in Latin America that economic transitions are very important. We've paid much less attention as Latin Americanists to energy transitions, to climate transitions. But one of the arguments that I want to make is that I think as we move through the next decades, the climate transition is going to be a very important transition for Latin America. And I think that we are rapidly reaching the point where we need to pay as much attention to this kind of political economy transition as the political economy transitions that we already look at as Latin Americanists. But my argument has a second side of it too. And the second side is that the approaches and tools that we're already familiar with are going to be useful to us in understanding this new political economy transition. So we don't have to completely rework our theoretical understandings. We can use the theoretical understandings that people like Peter Kingstone or Ben Rauch Snyder or Vicky Murillo used to understand other parts of political economy transitions. And one of the things they tell us is that there is a kind of basic structure of political and economic interests that underlie political economy transitions. But at the same time, it's not just a simple view of those interests, that what we also have in Latin American political economy transitions and comparative political economy generally is we have those interests, but then coalitions are built on top of them or not built on top of them. Those are responsive to existing institutions because these transitions don't come in a vacuum. They come in response to the institutions that are already there. And they're very responsive to the power relations in the existing political economy of energy. And so there are different theoretical literatures that I end up drawing on in the book that help me understand then how those might be relevant for thinking about this new political economy transition of energy transition. And in the title, Political Economies of Energy Transition, what I'm really signaling is that there are a lot of things going on at once, that there are what I refer to as 4 different political economies of energy transition. And if, like Peter Kingstone, we're looking at how coalitions are crafted for and against reform, we actually have multiple processes of crafting coalitions going on at the same time, because wind and solar power actually are responding to or invoke a whole different set of interests. So on the one hand, there's climate change, and that has a particular structure of interests, but this is also an issue of industrial policy. It's an issue of distribution and consumption. It's an issue of siting infrastructure projects in particular locations. And each of these requires us to draw on different theoretical literatures. It brings in different state actors. So the Ministry of Environments are very active on climate change, very active on the question of environmental impact assessment in the 4th political economy. But ministries of environment rarely do anything about industrial policy. They're not involved in consumption issues. And there we find ministries of economy, ministries of industry, labor movements. We find public utilities providing electricity. And so And each of these political economies is going on at the same time. These structures of interest, and on them are being built different coalitions. And then there's a final thing that my book says we need to do, is that we then need to look at how those different political economies interlock. Do they reinforce each other so that maybe there's a policy towards climate change and there's an industrial policy that supports it for wind and solar power, et cetera? Or do those political economies in some ways counteract each other? Maybe there's a political economy in favor of climate change, but the industrial policy is oriented towards supporting fossil fuels. And so we need to then look finally at that whole set of the interlocking political economies to think about what a national political economy of energy transition looks like. And to start making this more concrete, we'll start with climate change, which I start with in the book, because I do think that this is an important framing political economy for energy transition. And this is a topic that I think is best handled theoretically through some of our classic state capacity literatures. And here I'm really asking a question that's very much like the book Bringing the State Back In and other books about developmentalism. But do states have the capacity to identify long-term national interests and work towards them, even when there might be powerful actors working against them? And here, I think this is the real heart of the contrast between South Africa and Brazil. And you can understand a great deal of what happens in those two countries by understanding their greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the South African chart there on the left, that top line is South Africa's energy sector. And in fact, half of those greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by just two actors: Eskom, the electricity parastatal, which is building and operating coal-fired electricity plants, and then also a second Sasol, which is a second industry that is also working with fossil fuels. And so in the South African context, there are tremendously powerful actors in the electricity sector who are committed to fossil fuels. And you literally cannot address South African climate change interests without considering and taking on, the state has to take on those very powerful actors. In the Brazilian context, in contrast, the top line is deforestation and land use change. And so it's a really different starting point for climate change, because deforestation is a hugely contentious issue in Brazil, as you know, if you know anything about Brazil at all. And the contestation over deforestation, the Bolsonaro government, and its attacks on climate policy are really focused on deforestation. And in contrast, what that means is that you don't have such powerful actors oriented towards fossil fuels in the electricity sector in Brazil. So you can do different things in the electricity sector in Brazil. You can address climate change in Brazil without directly taking on the electricity sector. And so this is the comparative core of the book. So this sets South Africa and Brazil on different tracks. And I have just one more slide on South Africa to show you where this takes us. I know that you're primarily Latin Americanists, and Andres is really interested in the South Africa part of it. And I can come back and answer questions about that. But I'll talk about South Africa and what this turns into for South Africa, and then spend most of the time on Brazil. So in South Africa then, you have this. You have a huge existentially driven fight between the actors that are associated with that parastatal Eskom that builds coal, and then a counter coalition of actors that are connected to wind and solar power. And that's really, and South Africa has a kind of reinforcing cleavage there, where it's the public utility that builds all the coal and nuclear power, and private corporations build all the wind and solar power. And so all of the big fights about public versus private are also enter into this debate about coal versus wind and solar. And what that does is it creates these, as I call them, reinforcing coalitions. Basically, the same actors show up in chapter after chapter. Normally, public utilities don't pay that much attention to some things like climate change. Well, they're increasingly paying attention, but normally they don't. But you have then these same coalitions that are fighting over climate change. They show up again to fight over industrial policy. They fight over cost issues. The Ministry of Environment has no capacity. The Department of Environment has no capacity to really handle climate change because of the power of these other actors. And what you end up with in South Africa is you end up with a highly politicized mode of transition. This is, headline news every day, the electricity sector in South Africa, huge amounts of contention, political actors very much taking sides on all sides of the debate, and a lot of links to wider questions about politics and economics in South Africa, including things like the right balance between public and private actors. And you also have then a very contentious just transition debate where some of the actors that have become part of the coalition supporting coal are the labor movement, for example, which is increasingly worried about the jobs that it has that are linked to coal. Most of those are Black South Africans. It's not clear that they would have really the skill set to do other jobs. You have, again, Black South African communities that are built around the coal mining industry. And so you have, it's not a simple fight, but it really raises some of these questions of how can you make a transition away from coal when there are so many of South Africa's, especially Black South African populations that are really dependent on it. And this is why you get that picture then in South Africa. These two coalitions essentially fight themselves to a standstill, and they really can't make very decisive decisions. They're still stuck in a standstill on their energy transition. Brazil starts out then in a really different place. So as I was saying, most of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions are in the area of deforestation. And so I think many people aren't even aware of the fact that Brazil actually has a powerful cross-partisan consensus on wind and solar power. So it started under the Cardoso government. Lula picks up the policies and goes forward with them. Dilma Rousseff continues them. Michel Temer continues them even after Dilma is impeached. And then the Bolsonaro government, virtually the only pro-environment policy that it has is actually that it favors wind and solar power. And so the Brazilian foreign minister, when he travels around Europe, says things about how good Brazil's solar industry is and the like. So it's unusually cross-partisan support for it. And so what you get in the Brazilian context then is the bureaucrats take over. And so in each of those political economies, much of the activity is actually then done by bureaucrats following standard procedures, doing typical things, and wind and solar power rarely make the headlines. There's one exception that you'll see as I work through the political economies. But basically what this means is that it's rather hard to use climate change to understand what's going on in Brazil. So these are the successive 10-year plans in Brazil for wind and solar power. They always start out at the current reality and then project out 10 years into the future. And you can see there's a real steady upward line. Brazil starts to produce wind and solar power, and then it just continues very steadily. And we know that this is not climate driven, this difference between wind and solar power, because the climate motivation says build a lot of wind and solar power. It doesn't say start building wind in 2007 and start building solar power 7 years later in 2014 and go much slower. So there's not a climate logic to the Brazilian outcomes in a variety, in this variety of ways that I've been discussing. So industrial policy then. Does this help us understand what's going on in the Brazilian context? And I should say, if you haven't picked this up, but my basic methodology in this book is to look at each of these four political economies to outline and see what the dynamic of that political economy is, and then to ask whether or not it helps us understand the outcomes in one country or another. So climate change really does not help us understand that differential outcome between wind and solar power in Brazil. But what about industrial policy? So this goes to the idea that you might be able to have states provide incentives to private actors or public actors, but to actors to try to engage in targeted activities that would promote a public end like energy transition, but also promote private ends for the firms involved. So there's some real direct interests of wind and solar firms that get involved. I talk a lot in this chapter about rent management strategies and how the states do and don't maintain a balance between public and private ends. But it's a very different chapter, and it looks at questions like how many jobs are created, under what kinds of industrial policies are used to promote wind and solar power or not used. And so what we find here is the initial policy Proinfa from Cardoso has a feed-in tariff and then a requirement of 50% local content. So you can produce wind and solar power for the Brazilian grid, starting in 2001 is when this policy is initiated. But you have to have 50% production in Brazil. And then when Lula comes in a year later, he just increases that to 60% local content and has that same kind of requirement though. If you want to build wind and solar power for the grid in Brazil, you need to be using Brazilian steel, you need to be using Brazilian technology, Brazilian labor, and the like. Most of Brazil's wind and solar power does not come in through Proinfa. Proinfa is a very small program. Most of Brazil's wind and solar power actually comes in through auctions. And auctions are basically where private actors or public actors, in fact, the biggest winner of auctions for wind and solar power in Brazil is Eletrobras. So Brazil lets public and private actors bid to build electricity for the grid. And those are price-based. You are allowed to build wind and solar power for the grid if you are the cheapest possibility. And the first successful wind auction happens in 2009. The first successful solar auction happens in 2014. And in both cases, those really get started when costs become low enough. So that's actually political economy 3 is costs, but that's also coming. So that is part of the story though. The auctions begin when the costs are cheap enough. These auctions that the Ministry of Energy designs do not have any local content requirement or industrial policy. But remember I said it really matters what the institutional context is that these policies come into. Price-based auctions. How do you win a price-based auction in Brazil? Well, you get cheap finance from the BNDES. And BNDES has a 60% local content requirement. So even though the procurement program has no industrial policy connected to it, because half of the winners in wind power in particular had low-cost finance from BNDES, and it has this local content requirement, you got a lot of industry development in wind power because everybody wanted to be on the BNDES's lists of being able to provide to these new wind power plants with their Brazilian produced content. And you have a lot of businesses that move to Brazil and Brazilian businesses that move into the wind area. And this is now part of the explanation of why solar power lags. Because the BNDES finance for solar power was not cheap enough to counteract the higher domestic prices in the components line. So this is a very important part, but as I say, the only thing that really creates this outcome is not the wind and solar policy itself, but BNDES's policies on industrial policy, that historic BNDES preoccupation with creating jobs and things like that. So the difference between the two very much comes from the industrial policy political economy. This is a very important part of this. The existing industrial structure in Brazil made it much easier to have 60% local content in wind than in solar. And if you just think about it, just giving you one example of one industry, if you can build an airplane, you have many of the tools and many of the inputs to build a wind turbine. They use curved metals, and there's a lot that transfers from the one to the other. So that's just one example of how some of these things happen. And then there is what the literature refers to as a green spiral, where you get a first bit of a wind industry, it comes back and it lobbies for more wind power procurement. Then you get a bigger wind industry and it comes back and lobbies for more. And there's a sort of positive reinforcing cycle between these wind manufacturers and installers and the politicians who support them, that then contributes to that real takeoff in wind power. The other thing to note is that the early wind expansion did come through the Workers' Party governments that had more expansive industrial policies, more expansive policies for BNDES finance, and that by the time solar comes along in 2014, it doesn't have access to some of those same supporting industrial policies that wind power had had. So again, the timing ends up really mattering for the outcomes. And then when you look at the outcomes, there are very different industrial policy outcomes. So my best estimate, and I work with a lot of different data sources here, is that there's something like 100,000 wind jobs currently in Brazil, and about 25% of those are in manufacturing. So they do in fact manage to achieve some of that industry that they're looking for. There are about 10,000 solar jobs currently. Almost all of them are in installation. So there's very little in the way of a Brazilian production chain in solar power. Then continuing on, distribution and consumption. For whom does the state provide electricity services and at what cost? And then my secondary question is, how do wind and solar power affect those choices? And so if you look at the Workers' Party's Luz para Todos plan, this is very typical of the kind of policy that is a distribution and consumption policy. So there's about 6 to 7% of the Brazilian population that does not yet have electricity at the point that these discussions start. And most of the way that Luz para Todos brings electricity to those customers is by expanding the grid and then contracting wind and solar power for the supply. So most of Brazilian wind and solar power is grid scale. It's very large installations that are located in the places where there is wind power. So up in the Brazilian Northeast for wind power, and down in Rio Grande do Sul also for wind power. Solar power is much more present across the country, obviously, but most of it is grid scale. And so, as I was saying last time, and here you have those planning documents again for wind and solar power, planners, technocrats, and the bureaucracy look to see when the costs get cheap enough, and then they write plans to do more wind and solar power, and the costs come down, and then they do yet more wind and solar power. There's a very strong cost dynamic going on in this differentiation between wind and solar power too. There is some small scale solar power. A lot of times when people talk about the impacts of solar power for developing countries, they focus on the possibility for household level or small scale solar power. There's very little of that in the Brazilian context. Especially there's very little of it in the sense of bringing people onto the grid who were not on the grid before. As you can see in the Amazon, the more remote areas in the Amazon, 3,500 households. So this is really not a very large number of households and not a very important implication of solar power, not a big driver of solar power. But then conversely, you have 4 to 5 bureaucrats in ANEEL, which is the electricity regulator, change some of the regulations in 2011, 2012, 2014, 2015. And suddenly, because of the change in these regulations that bureaucrats do, and they deliberately do it in a way that doesn't require the National Congress to get involved. So they're just using their regulatory tools, suddenly make it much more possible to have distributed generation in Rio de Janeiro, in Sao Paulo, in farms across the rural areas. And as you can see here, that then has begun a really dramatic increase in small scale solar power. It's mostly not reflected in those numbers yet, but it will be. And this is going to be a very important element of solar power, but it just isn't yet. But this is a big change, and again, comes primarily from bureaucratic action as opposed to being something that is openly debated. Luz para Todos gets headlines, but doesn't have much impact on this except through the grid scale. So then we have a final question. And this is a question I know that some of you have been doing work on in various kinds of ways. Do local communities look at these wind and solar installations coming in, and do they see those as costly for them, or do they see benefits from these installations coming in? And in particular, what I'm looking at here is really, it's a study of social movements and community mobilization, and asking, do we see community mobilization around wind and solar power? And what does that tell us about whether local communities see costs or benefits from them? And there have been studies of Brazilian communities' opposition to wind power, because there are some communities up in Rio Grande do Norte and Ceará that have been very much mobilized against having these big wind power installations put into their communities. But what I did in this project was I used Google, and I did systematic internet searches on the name of every last one of Brazil's 600 wind power plants, and then the 77 cities that they were in. And it was basically these searches for the name of the project and then eólica or eólico, and looking for just anything that might appear from that project, and looking to see if there were community challenges recorded. And it was an interesting research strategy. And Google came back to me at one point and it said, "Are you a robot? You are behaving like a robot." Because I just kept putting in all these names of all these cities and wind and solar, and looking for looking to see if there was contestation. Because part of my instinct from working on social movements more generally is to know that we tend to look for contestation where it is, right? We study a social movement because it exists. And so my question was, how typical are those cities where there's contestation over wind power? Is that unusual, or is that typical in the Brazilian context? And in the end, in 77 cities that have wind installations, 19 of them did have significant community challenges. So that's about 25% of them. There were none of solar power that I could find. And my searches were finding Facebook pages, blog postings, local newspapers, the sorts of sources where you would imagine that there would be reports of contestation if a community gets organized around wind and solar power. Couple of really interesting observations about these challenges. One of them is, remember which one of these wind and solar power does well? It's wind power. There's also lots of contestation around wind power, but it doesn't stop the growth in wind power. So even though there's a lot of contestation here, what it often does is it moves a wind power installation from one location to another. So from a location where communities are mobilized to locations where communities are not. And people who are building wind power in Brazil are starting to be a lot smarter about where they think about putting in their projects. Because most of the challenges, and this is a second really interesting observation, these are not aesthetic challenges about bird life and things like that for the most part. These are challenges in the poor Northeast And most of them are about things like livelihood strategies, land tenure questions. There are some Quilombola communities that resist it, that haven't had historical legal access to their land. And so now a wind farm comes in and blocks their access to the beach, or a wind farm comes in and it's in a place where they have historically gotten water. Or there are small tourism kinds of activities that get interrupted by these wind farms. And so, as I say, and there are also some of the earlier projects in particular were put into moving dunes, were put into some protected areas. And so we're actually located in very problematic locations. And so this is a place where in the Northeast, there is a strong framing of environmental justice and about making sure that wind power plants are not being put in these locations where they really challenge the livelihood strategies of poorer communities. Interestingly, there are no contestations of wind power in Rio Grande do Sul, which you probably know is a wealthier location. In Rio Grande do Sul, wind power plants tend to have things like their own Facebook pages, and you find notices about school children going out to visit them and things like that. So a lot of the contestation over wind power in Brazil is really in the poorer communities, which in some ways runs against our expectations about community mobilization. So when you put those together and you look at Brazil's national transition pattern, then you find that the four political economies are largely self-contained. The actors who show up in one category do not show up in the next political economy. And instead, you have these, you have different levels of evident impact. The political economies of industrial policy and cost, they are linked, are probably the most important for the Brazilian outcomes. So if you want to know why Brazil has a lot of wind power and very little solar power, look to industrial policy and cost. And the other observation about Brazil is that this is a largely bureaucratic mode of transition, where the important decisions follow conventional standard operating procedures, cost-benefit calculations, the sorts of things that bureaucrats pay attention to. It is not the kind of politicized transition that we saw in South Africa. And I suggest, and now going into some of the bigger kinds of arguments, I suggest that where the science and technology world sees a very flat, depoliticized world and expects everybody to have lots of wind and solar power, that we might actually have varieties of national energy transitions. And that when you have a major, powerful fossil fuel electricity sector that sees an existential threat in the transition to wind and solar power, that you will get the kind of politicized mode of transition that we saw in South Africa, with lots of contention, lots of engagement by political actors, lots of engaging of wider political economy debates. Then when you have a fossil fuel, when you have an electricity sector that does not have such dependence on fossil fuel, like the Brazilian case, you get this more bureaucratic mode of transition where it's more technical and made according to technical decision criteria. And now a bunch of you are going to lose the question you were planning to ask, because the next slide, and the last slide, is sort of what does this mean for Latin America? And Latin America is an interesting region because it's a region that is unusually likely to have hydropower. And so, especially South America. And so many of these countries, if you're looking simply at electricity, are going to have a situation much like the Brazilian case. I make the observation that hydropower is better for climate change than for other environmental issues. And people often ask me about hydropower. I can come back to this, but this is a really significant green versus green issue. You know, you can have a kind of electricity that's good for climate change, but bad for other environmental issues. And I think this is actually one of the things that probably has helped open the door to wind and solar power in Brazil, where the other environmental issues around hydropower are so contentious and so problematic that planners are looking for alternatives. And right before I left Canada, and I am just wrapping up here, Andresa, right before I left Canada, I got a grant funded that I had to leave behind when I came to the UK in 2016 But we did a survey in 2015 looking at Mexico and South America. And at that point, we found that all of those countries, except for Chile, did have policies that were promoting wind and solar power for industrial policy or consumer supply or both. And so that makes me think that in terms of the electricity sector, that other Latin American countries are likely to look quite a bit like the Brazilian case. But you notice I'm saying electricity, electricity, electricity very carefully. Because if you actually ask about energy, well, many of the countries that in Latin America have, of course, deeply entrenched and powerful fossil fuel sectors. So to get a broader energy transition beyond electricity, you have many countries that will see strong opposition from the fossil fuel sector, petroleum, oil and gas primarily. And I think this raises some really critical framing questions for proponents of wind and solar power. Is it most useful to frame this as a climate issue? Should one try to hide the energy connections? Is this a good industrial policy strategy? That's obviously was very convincing in the Brazilian context, but I think it does raise some broader issues about how we think about electricity and energy. And I'm hoping that at least some of you listening to me are going to be joining me in this research effort. So many thanks for your attention. Looking forward to your comments. There is a 20% discount on the book right now with this code. So do feel free to take advantage of that. And I'm very happy to hear what you have to ask me about it.
Thank you very much, Kathy. This was a fascinating presentation.